Hi, my name is Irina Ryshkova and I'm your nonprofit auditor. I have a small CPA firm located in downtown Oakland, and we serve nonprofit organizations providing assurance, audit review, and tax services. And today, our NAP number 3. NAP stands for Nonprofit Auditor Points. These videos, very short, designed to educate nonprofit community, financial advisors on complex and common accounting and auditing topics. Before we begin, I would like to have a disclaimer. This is not authoritative video. In this video, I'm sharing my professional knowledge and experience, and this video is designed just to help nonprofits. Given the complexity of accounting standards and nuances of nonprofit financial reporting, it is important for your organization to consult a qualified accountant or financial advisor to address any specific case. Thank you, and let's start. To remind, we will be discussing all accounting standards based on GAAP, General Accepted Accounting Principles in the United States. And today's topic is in-kind. Why in-kind? In-kind contributions are sometimes very material area for most nonprofits, and they can push nonprofit over specific threshold for compliance requirements. Also, in-kind are very overlooked topic for nonprofit organizations, and it is very unique just for nonprofit organizations. Therefore, a lot of accountants, bookkeepers that do not work with nonprofits a lot, not familiar with this topic. And in-kind are critical in the current world because more and more organizations receive donations in kind form. What is in kind? In kind, it's donation that receive in non-financial assets, not cash, not investments, non-financial assets. There are 3 main categories of in-kind donations, and we will be discussing all of them. Number 1 are goods. Number 2, in-kind services. And number 3, use of facilities. Let's talk about in-kind goods. In-kind goods include everything tangible that nonprofit can receive from a donor. It can be supplies, it can be food, it could be clothing, and various other tangible assets. It can also be fixed assets such as equipment, land, or building. Valuation of in-kind donations, in-kind goods in this case, are very important, and standards are very clear that needs to be valued at fair market value at the date of donation is made. What is fair market value? Typically for goods, it means that would be resale value of the asset that was donated. How nonprofit can obtain fair market value of goods? Very often it could be open markets such as eBay, or typically resale value, what management can estimate the value of the asset. In-kind donations valuation will involve management estimate. That's one of the estimate that is disclosed on financial statement. It does not need to be precise. It's a high-level estimate, but it needs to be based on a fair market value. Standards also require that on financial statements, if nonprofits performs financial audit or review, the methodology of the evaluation for in-kind goods needs to be disclosed, and type of in-kind goods that nonprofit receive needs to be disclosed. For example, it's going to be land, building, supplies, food, etc. Now, let's talk about how do we record in-kind goods donations. If it were supplies, if nonprofit received supplies that were used in the same year, then nonprofit will record revenue and expenses. So you will debit expenses and credit revenue in the same year. In a sense, it will be wash, net will be zero. However, GAAP specifically record in kind, not at net. We cannot net revenue with expenses will be zero. We have to record it at gross revenue and expenses. If supplies that were donated they were not used in the same year, for example, nonprofit received a lot of school supplies that needs to be distributed to children, and nonprofit was only able to distribute half of the donation. Another half is still inside the nonprofits. Then this part that was non-distributed asset is recorded as the other asset. So if the supplies were not used, it will be asset and revenue. So it will be debit asset and credit revenue. In the next year, when supplies are distributed, and they will be expense. So we will debit expense and credit the asset. What would we record if nonprofit received fixed asset? It could be equipment, could be land, could be building. Then we need to record fixed asset and revenue. It will be debit fixed asset, for example, let's just say building, donated building, and credit revenue. Sometimes fixed assets can be donated with explicit restriction from the donor. I want to repeat, only if it's explicit restriction on the use of building of the fixed asset or equipment made by a donor. In this case, the donation of the fixed asset will be recorded as restricted net asset. So it will be restricted revenue and fixed asset, and in the balance sheet on the part of net assets, that will be recorded as restricted net asset. If, for example, building was donated by a donor with the restriction that this building only can be used as a school in perpetuity, and the building cannot be sold, it's explicit donation restriction by donor, then it will be restricted in perpetuity. If donor restricted donation, for example, that needs to be used building as a school for 5 years, then it will be restricted by time, temporarily restricted by time. So to repeat, we just discussed in-kind goods, how they can be recorded, how they should be assessed, and we provided some examples of in-kind goods. As an auditor, I noticed that very often in-kind donations, goods specifically, are not recorded correctly. And the main reason is a lack of good internal control for in-kind. What I mean by that, nonprofits do not need to create anything sophisticated in order to capture in-kind supplies correctly. There are two things needs to be done. There has to be some tracking system made by operation folks to make sure that they track how much in-kind supplies was donated. And number two, this information needs to be communicated to finance or accounting department. This lack of communication between operating and accounting very often cause significant underreporting of in-kind goods. Now let's talk about in-kind professional services. Second type. Nonprofits do receive a lot of in-kind services. They receive a lot of services from volunteers, from board members, and various professional organizations, companies, and individuals. Some of those in-kind services do not meet criteria of recognition. When we're saying criteria for recognition, it means there is nothing needs to be recorded in the accounting system. but some of them do. And it is important to understand what in-kind services needs to be recognized and recorded on financial statements. Standards are very clear that in-kind services should be recognized and recorded on financial statements if one of two criteria is met. First criteria, if nonprofit receives services that creates or improve non-financial asset. And number two, in-kind received services that require professional skills provided by a professional that possesses those skills. And these services otherwise would have to be purchased by a nonprofit if they were not donated. So this is a long criteria that consists of 3 parts. But the first criteria was in-kind services that create or improve non-financial asset. Let's see an example of such service. That would be volunteers that either build or improve building or some other asset. It can also be, example, sometimes volunteers can create costumes for theater. Sometimes volunteers can write a program, computer program, that can be used by a nonprofit. All of these are creation or improving non-financial asset, and they don't have to be provided by professional. But if they do create an asset or improve existing asset, these value of these services needs to be assessed and recorded as revenue and credit revenue and debit asset, whatever asset was created. If they built a building, that would be the building. If they were remodeling the building or remodeled the building that was leasing, it would be leasehold improvements. Or if it was costumes created by volunteers, it would be fixed asset, right? Or costumes, some sort of asset on the books. Or if it was IT program was developed, it will be also asset on the books. So this is non-professionals providing or improving or creating non-financial asset. Another criteria for recognized in-kind services, if professional services provided by a professional person that possesses those professional services and would otherwise purchase by a nonprofit if not donated. This is very common for nonprofits, and typical example of such professional services are architect, nurses, psychotherapy services, bookkeeping, attorneys, any professional services that nonprofit received otherwise would be purchased by nonprofit if not donated would be recognized. This third part that I repeated several times already, that states otherwise would have been purchased by nonprofit if not donated, is very vague and very hard to assess. Standards are also not very clear how nonprofit can determine what would be purchased. And I would give you some guidance saying that if the effort of the organization and service would have been provided by salaried employees if not donated, they're definitely meeting the criteria. One example when the criteria would not have been met, I would give you an example. If nonprofit has a fundraising event, and let's just say Taylor Swift decided to stop by and give a performance. So she just stopped by and sang a song. during the fundraising event. Wouldn't be nice. Uh, it's definitely very, very wonderful treat for a nonprofit event. However, most nonprofits probably would not purchase her services for their fundraising event because it would be very expensive. In this case, most likely nonprofit would not recognize in-kind revenue for this kind of in-kind services. And let's talk about how would you recognize revenue. So if the services provided by professional person in their professional capacity, most likely they would know their hourly rate and they will advise nonprofit their how much of in-kind donation in professional services they provided to nonprofit. So typically lawyers, accountants would send a letter to nonprofit and saying we donated X amount of hours and our billable rate is that much. So nonprofit would know how much in-kind professional services needs to be recorded on their accounting system, and nonprofit would record revenue and expenses, professional services. Again, it will be wash, but it is required to record it gross revenue and expenses in the year when professional services were provided. To assess fair market value of donated non-professional services that were created to create or enhance non-professional asset is much more difficult, and nonprofits need to use other fair market value sources to assess the value of the asset that was created. For example, if some leasehold improvement was made in an asset was enhanced, for example, they painted the building, therefore the nonprofit might actually go and get value of similar services provided by professionals and get approximate fair market value for such services. To record them also would be debit leasehold improvements and credit in-kind revenue. Sometimes nonprofit can receive advertising or marketing services for several years. For example, magazine can say to nonprofit, we're going to put your advertising for 2 years. How much in-kind nonprofit would recognize? If nonprofit receive donation, first of all, it should be measured at fair market values and recorded as revenue and expense when expense is recognized. Let me give you an example. If newspaper is saying that we can provide 20 ads for your nonprofit, and they don't specify the period, and in year one, nonprofit actually puts 20, less than 20, let's just say 10 ads. So therefore, nonprofits still have 10 more free ads to use in future. But for this year, only 10 ads was used. The value of 10 ads advertisement needs to be assessed, and that value would be recorded as revenue and expenses. To conclude, you cannot record value of future in-kind services that were not provided yet to nonprofit as revenue. Only the ones that were used this year. Same goes with the miles, traveling miles, for example, or free airfare. For example, if nonprofit received donation from airline company that they can use X amount of free miles or tickets flying, but the amount of revenue and expenses that nonprofit will recognize in the year, only the amount of miles or airfare that was used. The remainder will carry over to the next year, but there is no value to unused airfare or advertising. There is one more in-kind type of revenue I would like to discuss with you. Would be in-kind rent, and I would like to make a different video about in-kind rent because it's a beast on its own. Thank you so much. Just to conclude, we were talking about in-kind donations for nonprofits, and specifically we covered in-kind goods and in-kind services. Thank you so much, and looking forward to see you for NAP number 4. Thank you.